Section 95374. The example written in Section 95375C1 states that this equipment is prohibited from use in California, and they don't understand how this makes sense. Can you help untangle that?
Wait, I'm sorry. So, well, what it has to state that specific disclosure statement. So, there's no flexibility in the language. Okay, so that's what it has to state on it.
Okay.
But in terms of what that means, you're asking what that means.
Maybe you can repeat that.
Sure. Clarification on the required content of disclosure statement in subarticle 5, section 95375 is the intent that manufacturers state that their products comply with Title 17, section 95374. The example written in section 95375C1 states that this equipment is forbidden from use in California, and they don't understand how this makes.
It's not that we're not asking that they say that it complies. We're asking that the purpose of this disclosure statement is to put the end user on notice that there are certain refrigerants that certain pieces of equipment cannot be, or foams cannot be used with. And so, pieces of equipment. And so the purpose of this, first off, again, I just want to reiterate, it has to state this exact language, okay? But the purpose of it is to put the purchaser, the end user, on notice that there are refrigerants that cannot be used with in California. So it's not just to say, oh, it complies. So that's not good enough.
Okay.
And because this is covering a range of equipment, which includes maybe doesn't include equipment your industry makes, but refrigeration equipment, as you know, there's a whole wide range where a lot of the equipment gets charged on site. So that was the other purpose, that, for end users who are charging these systems on site, that they are on notice that they cannot be using prohibited refrigerants in these systems.
All right. That said, those are all the questions that I have received prior to our call today. So let's open the floor. Are there additional questions that have not been addressed or that need additional clarification? We'll open it and hopefully take them one at a time if there are any.
Charlie, yes, this is Bill Sickles. Something was mentioned a little bit earlier when you were talking about foams, and the date based on the U.S. EPA SNAP being January 1st, 2020, not January 1st, 2019 for NAFEM-type equipment. And I'm looking at the California SNAP enforcement that came, or the final regulation order that came, is the link with Charlie's email. And foams are listed after retail food equipment. And it says prohibited as of January 1st, 2019. So I just want to be clear, that's kind of like just standalone foams, not used in refrigeration equipment.
Yes,
2019?
Yes. Yeah, okay. I think if you go back to EPA's fact, EPA had, so basically our rules adopted EPA rules, right? So EPA actually has a whole list of foam categories, foam end users. And so the California SNAP, which was adopted recently also, only, and the dates you're talking about, January 1, 2019, in that table, it talks about, the first few foam categories, but there's another list of foam end users that actually specifically mention commercial refrigeration, sandwich panels, and kind of equipment that you are talking about. And for that, the dates are January 1, 2020, and that's in the SB 1013 portion and not necessarily in this final reg order. So I hope everybody understands there's two rules here. There's the rule that was a partial SNAP that was adopted in California, which covered only very few foam end users, the very beginning ones, I guess. But then SB 1013 adoption that also happened last year covered the entire SNAP and now covers all these other foam end users. So if you can go back and look at the EPA Rule 20, you'll see a whole list of end users in there to break it out as to which ones affect your industry.
Right. One is the statute, one is the regulation.
Right. And you are correct that the January 1, 2019 prohibition on rigid polyurethane board stock, in that case, it actually does refer to the board stock by itself as a separate product, whereas the food equipment would be covered under commercial refrigeration or appliance. They both have the same exact prohibitions and the same start date of January 1, 2020.
Yeah, and actually, Glenn, I'm also looking at if you look at the final reg order that you all have, there's actually a definition of rigid polyurethane and polyisocyanated laminated board stock, and it actually defines, and the last sentence actually reads, this does not include the following end use, and it lists all those, the ones that you were mentioning, which is commercial refrigeration. So the definition.
And I think this is a good time for my general disclaimer to everybody. I always, for the past 30-some years, have recommended, please read the entire regulation, including the definition, because the definitions are critical to understanding the regulation as that term is used in that regulation. And this is a pretty short reg as they go.
Yeah, at least it's not a 300-pager.
Yeah, totally agree with that.
All right, thank you.
If there's questions that people have, follow-up questions, we can make ourselves available, or if there's questions that are not proper to be discussed in an open forum, we can address those later on for you, because we want you to really understand how to comply.
Charlie, this is Stephen Schaefer. I've got two additional questions. First
Yes,
one being,
Stephen.
how long is given for the manufacturer to produce the records when they're asked for information on that? And the second one would be, are distributors responsible for record keeping, or is it just the manufacturer?
Yeah, I think actually, I think we state in the FSOR, let me just quickly look through the FSOR. I think we state in the FSOR within a reasonable time, and sort of what that means is, give me 1 second just to look through the FSOR. I believe we indicate that it's within a reasonable time, and I just don't know if we sort of identify what that means.
Quite often it depends on the individual case again of how many records do you have, how extensive, what is it going to take for you, and that's sometimes something that we'll work together on as to what is reasonable if it's not specified in the reg or as part of the documentation of the record keeping.
Yeah,
record making.
Yeah, and this is Shannon. I do a lot of enforcement cases, and we work with companies generally to, produce records, and sometimes it's something simple so they can get it to us within 1 week. Sometimes it's voluminous, and so it's going to take maybe 1 to 2 months. But I mean, if in the instance where we request records and 6 months go by with no communication and no records, at a certain point we're going to start looking at our administrative authorities to subpoena records and stuff. And of course, if we go down that route, it looks like there's no cooperation. So then one of those factors that we consider as a mitigating factor would kind of be removed from the scenario. So I think it's a reasonableness standard if the company's working on trying to gather the documents. There's communication going back and forth, and they're working towards it. That's one thing. That just says that they have to keep it for 5 years.
The second part of the question is record keeping is required of manufacturers or distributors.
Oh, okay, yeah. So it says any person who manufactures. So it's the record keeping requirement applies just to the manufacturers.
Okay.
But again, I mean, it behooves the distributors or anyone else to keep records because, again, if they can show that they had the statement or whatever, for example, let's say there's a disclosure statement, a concern over the disclosure statement or whatever, or who sold X piece of equipment to another end user. I mean, it behooves the company to be able to prove sort of what happened. But in terms of a record-keeping violation, it would be against the manufacturer of a motor-bearing new refrigeration equipment.
Yeah, just changing the subject slightly, this is Glenn Gallagher of CARP. I would like to clarify a question that I have now heard about 10 times, which is, in your list of prohibited substances, I see R290, which is propane, and R600A, isobutane, is on the list of prohibited substances for my standalone equipment, and we were actually planning on using those in the smaller equipment. They are not prohibited. If they're on the acceptable list, they're acceptable. What people are reacting to is a refrigerant mixture that contains R125 and 290 and 134A and 600A. That one particular blend is prohibited because the R125 makes a very high global warming potential, but if you only use R290 or you only use R600A and it's on the acceptable list for your equipment, it is acceptable. So in our guidance, I think we might reword that to say, and the following refrigerant blend that